Let's begin with the state of the nation. I mean, where is Britain now?
Bitterly divided. I mean, there's no way out of that. Bitterly divided, with the biggest decision it's taken in modern history, with, I think, a real threat to the cohesion of the United Kingdom, and with no very satisfactory solution in sight.
Do you think the United Kingdom itself can outlast this process?
Well, I think it's at risk, because you've now got a situation where if the arrangement, the deal Boris Johnson wants goes through, you've got a line down the Irish Sea. So Northern Ireland is going to be locked into Europe's trading system with the Republic of Ireland, whilst Britain apparently is going to be out of it. So obviously Northern Ireland, this will give a push towards a united Ireland and away from the United Kingdom. Scotland is then going to say, well, look, we voted for staying in the European Union. Why can't we have the same arrangements as Northern Ireland? So you'll get another shot in the arm for Scottish independence. So, it's a big problem. And one of the things I can't quite understand is why the English seem to be so dismissive of the risk to the Union, because England becomes less powerful if it breaks up the United Kingdom.
Well, there'll be another border, wouldn't there?
There'll be another border, or I mean, look, the one thing is for sure. I mean, I'm not saying it will happen. By the way, let's try and be balanced about this. There's still very powerful arguments for Scotland remaining inside the UK and for Northern Ireland remaining part of the UK. But the arrangements for Northern Ireland, the specific cutting adrift Northern Ireland from Britain, obviously helps the cause of republicanism in Northern Ireland, and Scotland's got an additional argument. The Nationalists have got an additional argument.
A Scottish unionist that I've known for years said to me a couple of weeks ago, I always thought the United Kingdom could survive Scottish nationalism, Irish nationalism, or Welsh nationalism, but it cannot survive English nationalism. Now, he takes a much more, from his point of view, gloomier view even than you do.
Yes, and by the way, if you go back in history, this has been a big debate around the United Kingdom, going back to Gladstone's time and Home Rule for Ireland. It was the failure actually to deliver Home Rule for Ireland that led eventually in the early 1920s to the split, the partition of the island of Ireland. And part of the problem is that in this sort of Brexit-dominated landscape, where you've got different parts of the UK that have different views on such a profound question, then of course you're bound to destabilize the whole of the union. But the point is, the United Kingdom as a United Kingdom is much more powerful than England on its own.
I have to ask you this question really bluntly. Do you trust the word of Boris Johnson?
I mean, not on Brexit, but in a sense, you shouldn't take any of these decisions through matters of trust. And that's why the core reason why, in my view, the Labour Party should not allow an election at the moment is until he gives a definitive answer on the question of whether there's going to be a no-deal outcome. Because what people don't understand, I mean, this is the problem with Brexit, is at one level it gets amazingly complicated. And even the people who study it every day and spend hours on it every day find it hard to follow all the twists and turns. But in essence, there's two negotiations. I mean, we made a fundamental mistake when we agreed at the outset of this negotiation that you'd have one negotiation around the terms of exit, and Northern Ireland was put into that negotiation because of the concern over the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. And then we agreed that after Brexit, there would be a separate negotiation, which is the future relationship between Britain and Europe. It's a terrible mistake, because what it means is you can do Boris Johnson's deal, but it doesn't take a no-deal outcome off the table, because in the second negotiation, a no-deal outcome is not merely possible. I think it's increasingly probable that you'll get no deal, because you're going to have a very short space of time to negotiate what is a complicated arrangement. And the Europeans are making it absolutely crystal clear that if Britain thinks it's going to have tariff-free access to European markets, but go its own way on tax and regulation and become some Singapore on the Thames type of thing, then the Europeans will say, no, we're not having it.
But that's exactly why I asked you about trust in Boris Johnson, because the first question I was asked recently on Irish radio was, do you believe the Prime Minister of your country? Do you routinely believe him? or do you routinely suspect that he may not be telling the truth given his track record? Now, that is a real problem for all the interlocutors, isn't it? It's a real problem for anybody in the European Union to know what they can trust. It's also a problem for people in Parliament to know if the Prime Minister of the country, who misled the Queen and did other things which we know about in his private life and led to him being fired and so on and so on and so on, if we can trust his word, or are we entering a kind of Trump land?
Well, look, the only thing that matters, frankly, for these for this situation is, do we trust him on Brexit? And the fact is that Boris Johnson is in an extraordinarily difficult position on Brexit, and he's determined to get it through because the Conservative Party believe that if they deliver Brexit, they can go back to being a normal Conservative Party. I think they're wrong about that, but that's what they believe. And, no, of course you can't trust him on Brexit. And if you want the best evidence for that, ask the Ulster Unionists. I mean, the Ulster Unionists were holding with the government all the way through. And now what they found is that actually he has sold out unionism, which is really what he's done with this deal. So, no, of course you can't trust him on Brexit. But in the end, this is too important to rely on the word of this politician or that politician. You need to decide what the country wants. And the reason why I keep saying to people, in the end, the only way you're going to resolve this satisfactorily is to ask the British people what they really want, given what we now know. And what we now know, and this is where, bizarrely, though I profoundly disagree with him on whether Brexit's a good idea, actually Nigel Farage has produced one of the better analyses of what the problem is with Boris Johnson's deal. And the problem in the end is, if you really want to diverge on tax and regulation and go your own way on issues to do with trade, if you really want that, the only way you're going to get that is actually by doing no deal. Because if you do a deal with Europe, they're going to bolt you down, as we've just seen in relation to Northern Ireland. So ultimately, the question for the British people is, do you want to do that no deal Brexit with all, I would say, the huge amount of economic problems and difficulties that's going to happen? Or do you want to stay? That is the actual choice. But if we go down this path and we end up with this sort of botched deal on Northern Ireland, which puts the union at risk, and then you get into this further negotiation, you're going to be back with exactly the same problem, except it's not going to be an Irish problem, it's then going to be a British problem.
Blair and Farage agree on something.
Well,
shock.
It's agree on the analysis that this deal doesn't resolve the question. And if it doesn't resolve the question, you shouldn't do Brexit before you've resolved where you're going. And this is the fundamental point. If we do this deal, okay, the public thinks, oh, get Brexit done, it's over. Fantastic, thank God, we no longer have to hear this word Brexit, can disappear from our lives. Sorry, literally the day after, you're going to be back in Europe trying to negotiate the really important negotiation, which is the future relationship between Britain and Europe. And you're going to be doing it, by the way, bumping up against the timetable of the end of next year in circumstances where you won't get the new European Commission in place realistically until early January, and when you're going to have to conclude that deal in order to get the legislation through, probably in the summer. Now, you tell me how that complicated negotiation is going to happen in 6 months. It's not. So you're going to be back to Europe, not merely negotiating a whole new range of negotiation over Brexit, but I absolutely guarantee you, if we go down this path, we'll be asking for an extension to Britain's transitional period. So the problem is the public thinks, and the Boris Johnson and the papers that support him are pushing this the whole time, that if you only back this deal, you're going to end up with the end of Brexit. You're not. You just open the new chapter.
But if all that is so obvious and self-evident, why is it that Labour has appeared to many people to be so useless, and I'm including people who are members of the Labour Party in Parliament?
Yeah, because the problem for Labour is that it thought that you can face both ways on Brexit, and you can't. I understand why. Let me try and, look, I'm not, as you know, the world's greatest supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, but let me try and understand it from his point of view. He's got Labour MPs and Leave seats who say to him, look, if I end up being against Brexit, I'm going to lose my seat. I don't personally believe that, but that's what they believe, and I understand he takes some account of that. And he's probably, frankly, pro-Brexit himself for old-style leftist reasons. So you've got this situation where Labour's tried to face both ways and it hasn't worked. The one thing, however, that Labour's been consistent about, the one thing, is opposition to a no-deal Brexit. If you want to ensure that there cannot be a no-deal Brexit, the only ways you are going to secure that is either you legislate for it specifically so that Parliament rules out in this next stage of the negotiation no deal, or the British people vote it down. Now, in my view, the Conservatives will never agree to legislate against no deal in the next stage of this negotiation, and that's why the obvious thing is to say to the British people, is that what you want?
But what's your advice to Labour voters? We might have an election before Christmas, who knows? In an election, should they, if they're Remain voters, should they vote Labour? Should they vote tactically? What should they do?
But this is the problem. I mean, I think it's extremely difficult because this is the difficulty of mixing up Brexit, which is a specific issue where there's a specific question, with the general election where you're dealing with all the general issues of the day and who forms the government.
But what would you do? You're a Labour voter.
Yeah, but that's why I advocate a referendum. But look,
but in a general election, you'd vote
exactly,
Labour.
And this is the
you'd
question.
Vote Labour.
Frank, I've always voted Labour. I'm not going to pretend to you it's not a real struggle for me because of my profound disagreement with the Corbyn leadership, but probably because of history, tradition, and because I am so passionately opposed to Brexit, I can see myself voting Labour. But I tell you this, and this is the problem for the Labour Party, there are a lot of people who are going to really struggle and go the other way on that. And let's be clear, this is why Boris Johnson wants a Brexit general election. I mean, if you're going to break the deadlock over Brexit through the people, tell me what possible rationale is there for doing that through a general election, not a referendum? But
also then, to pursue your point, if Labour were to lock in a no-deal legislatively now, it wouldn't matter after a general election. That could change anyway if Boris Johnson wins a majority, couldn't it?
Well, if you lock in legislation now, if Labour was to say to Boris Johnson, okay, I mean, look, I would prefer a referendum, but if the Labour Party leadership's not prepared to go for that, if it says to Boris Johnson, you've got to agree with us before you get your election that there's going to be opposition to no deal. We're not going to allow you to use an election essentially to claim a mandate for no deal when actually the election's about all sorts of different things and where you could get a majority as the Tory government even if the combined vote of the anti-no deal parties was larger. So if I was Labour now, and my principle is I will not tolerate no deal, they should insist that he agrees to that. Otherwise, they've got the whip hand at the moment, Labour. If it uses it sensibly, it can actually engineer the right result for the country.
Do you wake up in the morning glad that you're not involved in this mess or wishing that you were?
The latter.
You'd like to be back?
Well, back. I mean, and I participate obviously in the debates. But yes, of course, I'm deeply frustrated because I think that what's happened over the last few years is that there's been real grievances and anxieties in the country, around immigration, around questions of communities and people left behind by globalization. We should be dealing with those issues specifically, instead of which we've turned all of these grievances into this Brexit question. Well, Brexit solves nothing. I mean, all the decisions that matter to Britain are taken in Britain, not Brussels. The health service, crime, taxes, spending, even immigration actually from outside of European Union. So yes, of course, it's incredibly frustrating because at the same time as you've had this Brexit business and the Tory move to the right, you've had Labour Party captured by the far left and not able at the crucial moment of the country's history to provide coherent opposition.
Today's news appears to be
yeah.
that Boris Johnson may put his government on strike if he doesn't get his election.
It just shows you how completely irresponsible these people have become. And by the way, he's just had a Queen's speech. What's the point of having the Queen's speech if you're about to say that? I mean, we are in a situation of real crisis, and you've got to take a step back and say, what is the problem? And the problem is that we took this decision in June 2016 to leave the European Union. You cannot really argue that it's undemocratic now to say, in the light of all the misery, mess and mayhem, we've got to decide whether we actually want to proceed with this or not. And you can't really argue that no deal, which is a very possible outcome to Brexit, was mandated by June 2016. Okay, some of the Brexit people will say, yes, that's what we voted for. But the only way you're going to break the deadlock in a sensible way now is to say to the British people, right, in the light of everything that's happened, do you want to think again, or do you want to tell us the same thing again? And if you do that, by the way, you will end the argument. But if we end up in a situation, let's just take the situation that may well unfold, where you have a general election, partly because of, frankly, the fear of Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. The Tories win that general election. They win it, say, with 35%, 40, even 40% of the vote. The Lib Dems and Labour and the Greens and SNP and all the rest of it combined is over 50% of the vote. He's going to claim a mandate for no deal when a majority of people have voted against it. If that happens, I mean, I know people talk about the anger if you thwart Brexit, but what do you think the anger is going to be when the country thinks, right, a majority of us actually voted against the very thing you're now going to do? So if you want to resolve this, don't mix up a general election with Brexit. There's two separate questions. Who governs the country, and is it a good idea to proceed with Brexit? Ask the country specifically on Brexit. And if we did that, of course, yes, it would be a tough contest. But I accept, by the way, I mean, a lot of people don't agree with me on the Remain side, but I accept if you have the referendum, you've got to let the Brexit people make their case for no deal, because that is what they really believe. And frankly, in the end, that is the choice. And I know it sounds very binary to say, look, in the end, it's really no deal versus stay. But the reality is, it is. And I still think if you actually just had a little more time on this, people would see that a general election won't necessarily resolve. You might get a hung parliament, by the way. So you can't guarantee you resolve this. If you want to resolve it expressly and particularly. By the way, if you want to have a general election, have the general election. You can have an election and a referendum on the same day if you wanted. Just don't mix the two questions up, because they're different questions. And it's completely unfair to put people who may be anti-no deal but worried about Jeremy Corbyn in a bind. And it's completely unfair to have people who want Brexit but don't want a Tory government in a bind. You should have these questions decided separately.
You still in contact with a lot of foreign leaders, Narendra Modi, most recently a photograph of the two of you together. How are we seen round the world now, given that soft power, attracting everybody from Bill Clinton to President Rouhani of Iran to a British university was something that was part of our soft power for years? We've always been seen as brainy Britain. How do you think we're seen now?
Well, I mean, obviously people think our politics is a mess. We think our politics is a mess. I think the question is, I mean, to be clear about this, if we do Brexit, and by the way, if we do it, we've all got to try and make it work as best we can. And, you know, people will still want to deal with Britain. Britain's still an important country. You know, I say to any of the leaders I meet, you know, we're going through a difficult patch, but don't worry, Britain will be back, and, you know, we will want good relations with you and to advance our relations with you. All of that is correct. The problem is, from the point of view of Britain, we are weaker outside of Europe. I mean, it's just the way the world is. See, when you go to India, you see a country now with 1.2 billion people. It's rising all the time. By the middle of the century, it's going to have an economy probably twice, maybe 3 times our size, right? And then you've got America, and you've got China, and you've got these huge giants whose economies will be much, much larger than country number 4. So what are countries doing around the world today? What are people doing in Asia, Southeast Asia, where they're worried about the rising power of China? They're coming together in a regional group. So the rationale for the European Union today is very simple. It's not peace as it was in the 1940s or 50s. It's power. If you want to be at that top table with those 3 giants, you've got to be in a collective organization that makes up collectively for what you lack in individual size and weight. It's no disrespect to Britain or to Germany or France or any of the rest of it. It's just fact. You know, 65 million people versus over 1 billion people. I mean, come on. Or in the case of America, 400 million, as you know, with a huge economy, right? So this is the tragedy of Brexit. Of course, if we do Brexit, we're still Britain. We can still play our part in the world, but we will be less powerful. We'll have gone from being a top 6 Premiership side to the Championship. That's what we'll do. Now, can you then over time struggle your way back? Maybe. But it's not a sensible thing to do. Brexit, because it really doesn't solve any of our problems, do it if it gains you some huge advantage, right? Maybe do it. But what is that advantage? This is what I struggle with. And why do you think Boris Johnson, every time he's asked to give examples of what he wants to do with this great, new freedom we're going to have, what does he talk about?
Well, he says fantastic new trade deals around the world.
Right, okay. You think that we're going to do a better trade deal with these countries than the whole weight of the European Union can do? Have you tried doing a trade deal with India? I mean, come on. Or do you think when the Americans, and it's not Donald Trump who does the trade deal ultimately, he puts it to Congress. Congress will decide it. The Americans are going to do all the things we want on trade. Europe struggled to get a trade deal with these places. So I think the trade thing is illusory. But you go back to the laws he says he wants to pass. What examples does he end up having to give? He gives examples like what's to do with kipper wrapping? That turned out to be wrong. Truck windows? That turned out to be wrong. What does he do now? He goes around, because he's conscious of this, Boris Johnson. So he goes around saying, what we want to do, for example, is we want to create these free ports. This is his latest thing. Or we want to, with special tax advantages. Or what we want is for fintech, financial technology, the new companies, to have their own systems of regulation. It's completely illusory. The Europeans aren't going to allow us to set up free port zones on their doorstep where we give a whole lot of tax advantages and then sell tariff-free into their markets. They'll say, you want tariff-free access into the markets, don't undercut us on tax. And when it comes to financial technology, these fintech companies who will want to be global companies, they're going to want to be consistent with European regulation, with American regulation. It's a myth. So my point is, we're doing this Brexit thing for what in the end? For nothing. It's an illusion. It's a complete illusion.
Well, maybe we're doing it. We've only got a few minutes left. Maybe we're doing it because for 40 years there's been a political problem within the Conservative Party, which is spread elsewhere and was supposed to be remedied by a 2016 referendum. And that brings me to the final kind of area we have to face as a country. Whatever happens about Brexit, which is our institutions, some of them, are not up to scratch. And the fact that we are debating whether the Supreme Court should have a say in certain things, what is actually the role of the Parliament, what can the government really do? Do you think it is time to have, whatever happens, we will have to sit down and not just look at the relationship between Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and the rest of the country, London and the rest of the country, but also the major institutions which have not worked. And the idea of having an unwritten constitution as some glory has been shown to be a bit of a fraud.
Yes, I think there's a case for that now. Because
a written constitution.
I think there is a case for it. Look, in the end, the constitution doesn't solve difficult problems, but I do think there are two things that we need to debate and decide, and maybe, even though if you'd asked me a few years back, I would have probably said no to a written constitution, but I think there is a different necessity, a different imperative, if you like, today in debating this. The first is, we've got to decide we want a parliamentary democracy. I mean, the problem with direct democracy, you can see through this Brexit process, right? You vote. And this massively complicated thing, one day, in June 2016, yes, no, in, out, one off. It's not rational. It's just not a rational thing to do with a situation of such complexity. We have a parliamentary democracy because actually the people that created democracy in the UK realised that the sensible thing is you send people to Parliament, that's their day job. It's not the day job of the people outside of Parliament. They've got other day jobs. The day job of people in Parliament is to study the detail and come to a decision. If you don't like them, change the government. Okay. So parliamentary democracy, I think, is really important. And that's particularly so in this world of social media, which I think is, I'm afraid, a plague on modern politics, where people just think sort of you can just give direct instructions to government and then just say, well, you just got to go and do it then, you guys. Okay. It doesn't work. The second thing is the courts. In America, it's accepted that you have a Supreme Court and they are an ultimate guardian, if you like, of the constitutional arrangements. I think we've got to decide whether we want that here or not. Because, there's something really profoundly troubling when the courts came to their recent decision, which, by the way, they couldn't really come to another decision when you looked at the facts. And then Boris Johnson says they're wrong. And in a sense, the whole view of the Conservative Party and his media is to sort of undermine the courts. It's a very dangerous thing to do. So we do need to decide these things now. And I think if there's anything good that can come out of this ghastly process, is I think we've got to look at some very fundamental questions as to how we govern ourselves.
And do you remain optimistic, both that Brexit in some way can be ameliorated or abandoned or stopped, and that perhaps there may be a day of reckoning in which we look at ourselves as a country and come to better conclusions than we've got now?
Optimistic. Look, as you know, I'm an innate optimist and always have been. But you struggle with optimism at the moment, to be frank about it. But I think, look, the most important thing right now is just to focus on getting a rational process for deciding our future, and it isn't by a government that changes its mind every day. You've got a Queen's speech one day, calls for an election the next, says it's going to go on strike, a parliament that can't make up its mind, an opposition that frankly is all over the place day to day. Now, the most important thing right now, these bigger questions can be left for another time, is to get a rational way of the country understanding that however fatigued it is, however bored and irritated by the whole thing, the country started it in June 2016, the country's got to bring it to a finish in 2019.